Don't forget to record.
Too late. Okay, we're all being recorded. Even the walker is being recorded.
You on without?
Okay. So, um, so welcome everybody. The only rule is that I give a shortish chat in the beginning, trying to keep it very short. Well, okay, very short, not very short. And I can't cover everything or even a lot because it's a huge topic. The more I thought about it, the huger it became. But so there are people here from all over the place, and people will add their own thoughts about contradictions, etc., and discuss what I said or argue with me or both. Anyway, let me just start by saying we are all subject to internal contradictions of some sort. They've always been around as far back as say Adam and Eve. Conflicts with humans and within humans have gone hand in hand and have been affected by conflicts from outside, all of which are part of what makes us human. Just to tell you the difference between a paradox and a contradiction. A paradox defies logic and expectations. A contradiction is something that it contradicts itself, meaning it says something is true, then says the same thing is false. Basically, they are dissonance, and I mix them up a bit, but anyway. I'll give you an example of somebody contradicting what he's saying. Sam Altman, the chief executive of OpenAI, said he is scared of his technology, which threatens significant harm to the world and risk of extinction. And yet, innovation continues apace. If Altman's comments are not just hype, and he believes what he said, why is he moving forward? He does so and still believes that somehow the danger can be avoided. Here is a covert in contradiction. Now, contradictions are both subjectively and objectively true, and are reconciled subconsciously. It comes down to knowledge. As far as I'm concerned, it all comes down to knowledge. Knowledge is intrinsically contradictory. Now, is there such a thing as incorrect knowledge? We talked about this last month, but beliefs, true belief, justified belief, we won't go into it today. I maintain that it's possible to have knowledge of non-truth, of things that are not true. Not everybody accepts what I just said. Contradictions can consist of correct and non-correct, true and non-true. So to unpack contradictions seems impossible. I think it's possible, which I will try to show today. And then there's true with a small truth, and there's true with a tall truth, T. There are many truths. Each one is the objective belief that it is true with a big T. James is not here today. Pity, because he typed into chat, when we say there is truth, we're also saying there is untruth. Now that is true, and it is a contradiction. I'm trying to unpack contradictions and paradoxes. I think there are no such things as contradictions and paradoxes. They exist personally and subjectively and only fleetingly now, in inverted commas, and they consist of simultaneous ideas. But the fact that my now is not simultaneous with your now is not a contradiction. They are different nows. Neil deGrasse Tyson said, we can't access the past, we can't access the future, we live only in the present. I think that was his way of neutralizing contradictions, because I don't agree with him. We move forward to the future that is linked to the past. Without the past, I can't see how there could be a future. We move forward to a future that we can never get to. It will be the past when we get to what we said will be the future. We never actually get there, but we rely on the future. For example, having the floor beneath our feet when we get out of bed. That is an eternal contradiction. Art is paradoxically by nature, paradoxal by nature. It both reflects the past and creates the future. Maybe that's why we need art so badly. That was a quote from Josh Allen Dijkstra. Now, death is the greatest contradiction of all. We know we will die, yet continue on as if it will never happen. Now, I say that life is a long preparation for the thing that happens only to other people. So now we have a paradox of reality, the search for reality that must be fleeting, that is, always moving towards its disappearance, the ultimate conjuring trick where we trick ourselves. By the way, there's no such thing as magic. It's always a conjuring trick. We know it's a conjuring trick, yet we are fooled every time. This is a contradiction that is endemic to so-called magic. The word is, which we discussed a couple of months ago, is strangely consists of contradictions within it. Bill Clinton said in 1998, it depends on what the meaning of the word is. If is refers to that particular time, that was completely true. Distinction between is and was seized upon when Clinton told PBS right after the Levinsky story broke, there is no improper relationship. He was right, because at that time there wasn't. The contradiction between telepathy and coincidence, or free will versus determinism. You can think about that. In science, there was a very famous paradox, the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen EPR paradox. The paradox involves two entangled particles, such as photons or electrons, that are separated by a large distance. When one of the particles is measured, the state of the other particle is instantly affected, even though no signal can travel faster than the speed of light. This seems to violate the principle of locality, which states that no information can be transmitted faster than the speed of light. This has been discussed since then, and it has been shown, or tried to be shown, that there's no contradiction, etc. Now, the more you know, the less you know. Knowledge uncovers more information about what you do not know. Now, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about subjectivity within an objective world. Is that a contradiction? Does being one within a multitude indicate that we are unimportant, or on the contrary, that we are special? We don't know, even when we feel that we do know. Sometimes, often, we feel average, but at other times we feel unique. How can we help feeling unique and almost simultaneously merely products of a particular moment in history, a footprint that will disappear the moment we do? Now, the closer we get to anything, the more we see of less. The further out we move, the more we see of more, since space becomes synonymous with time that stretches to the past. Our vision is limited only technically through the devices available, while before us lies infinity. There will always be something smaller. That is, we will never get to nothing. And there will always be something further away. We will never get to everything. In that sense, there is no difference between close and far, between getting closer and getting further away, since all directions lead towards so-called infinity. Putting it another way, it is just as reasonable to consider our movement forward as being everything moving away from us, as it all moves back in time and space. One of the greatest paradoxes, as far as I'm concerned, is that we look at ourselves in a mirror, but see only how we see ourselves, not how others see us. We have no idea what we look like, basically. On the other side, I cannot see or feel what anyone else can see or feel, since I only know how I see or feel. This is the seeming paradox of subjectivity and objectivity within the same body. But it's not a paradox, since they work together but not simultaneously. Now, if we if we take, while we're at it, let's look at contradictions in philosophy. And we can, no better way to do so as to refer to Hegel, for whom contradictions were a cornerstone for his philosophy. He believed that contradictions are an inherent part of reality and that they are necessary for progress and development. According to Hegel, every idea or thing contains its own opposite, and the interaction between these opposing forces creates tension and conflict, which leads to synthesis or higher level of understanding. Now, while Hegel argued that these contradictions arise from the limitations of human understanding and that they are necessary for us to continually refine and improve our understanding of the world, I say that makes sense only if you believe it does, which I don't. As far as I'm concerned, there is no basis in the belief that the more mixed up you are, the better you'll feel about things, or that the contradictions will somehow be resolved. Let's, for a brief second, literature is full of contradictions. And look at the picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. His portrait ages and shows the effects of his immoral actions, while Dorian himself remains young and beautiful. This creates a paradox wherein the external appearance doesn't reflect the true nature of the individual. In Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, revolves around the paradoxical military regulation Catch-22, which states that a pilot can be grounded if he is insane, but if he requests to be grounded to avoid dangerous missions, it proves he's sane and must continue flying. So we can untangle contradictions by showing that they aren't contradictions at all. This would be very useful in all disciplines, particularly in the sciences. So while in philosophy and literature, paradoxes can be important in themselves, for the sciences, paradoxes are a block on the path to what is. I claim that the aim of scientific research is to untangle paradoxes and contradictions. Let's have a look at a couple of examples. We never see two events happening simultaneously, for light will necessarily take different lengths of time to arrive from different locations. However close the locations are, they cannot be in exactly the same place, and hence not at the same time for the observer. Basically, no two things can happen simultaneously, since no two things can occupy the same space and time. This was noted almost 400 years by Leibniz, whose Leibniz law can be paraphrased as, if two objects have the same properties, they are in fact one and the same. There is in fact no object that is the same as another object. It is here that we discern the unique situation for every individual, since each is in their own particular time, not shared with anyone else. This is a paradox. There's a paradox here, in that every person sees things in his own individual way and is at a different time from all others. Yet we share a commonality as humans. It is the paradox of approximate sameness. Let me just give a couple of words on statistics for some reason. The problem with statistics, they seem to have built-in contradictions. Statistics are necessarily general, necessarily relativistic, and approximate, always being in relation to something else. But basically, as far as I see it, they're a mess of contradictions and paradoxes. Statistics work out to 100% certain when approximation is zoomed into, until the event is 100% certain. That is, 100% certain that it will happen, or 100% certain that it won't. At that point, statistics come to a stop. When 100% chance of something happens is 0% chance of it not happening. Also, the larger the vista being looked at, the more certain something will be. For example, within the universe, there is a statistical chance that aliens exist. But if the stage is the Milky Way, the chances are smaller. Within the solar system, the chances are close to zero statistically. And taking any one planet, the chances are zero or very close to zero statistically. But there is more to it than that. Statistics will stop when the macroscopic event is 100% certain, as close as one can get. But the search continues when we zoom into something to look for ever smaller constituents at the microscopic level. That is, where statistics end, fundamental physics continues in its reductionist path. The problem here is that the smaller the items, such as a particle, the greater the energy required and the instrument to supply that energy. We're in the numbers game now. Large numbers do not get us closer to the truth. We all think that the more people that believe in something, the closer to the truth it will be. That isn't true. So it's something to do with the average. Many types of dogs does not give us the average dog, other than an approximate version. So many different versions of an event do not get us to what really happened. It gives an average. An average does not apply to any one thing. For example, an average chair is not comfortable per se. It just really isn't. So, by the way, here is an example of a paradox. When I was in the USA recently, in the USA, where individualism is a deeply held symbolic principle, the suburban housing layout is surprisingly open, at least where I went, with properties not separated by physical barriers, such as fences or hedges, as in the UK, for example. That's what I noticed, and it really surprised me. You'd think they'd be boarded off. So what have we done? What are we doing? We've maneuvered ourselves into a corner paradox. The paradox is that while observers are necessarily subjective, they're also absolutely convinced that their views are objectively true. But how can we know we're being objective? We could do one of two things. We could accept that a paradox is a fact of life and move on, or we could try and unravel it and then move on. I will, of course, do the latter, if only because what we have unearthed is only a seeming paradox consisting of contradictions that live together in peace as part of what it means to be human. One way of solving this is to claim that we are either subjective or objective beings. While it is logically clear that people are generally and necessarily subjective, who says so? We do. We all do as regards people in general. And there is the problem. The claim that each person has his or her subjective point of view is made only from a general, wide point of view, from above, which is equivalent to some elaborate mathematical framework accommodating all such views at once. Subjective on its own then is not the bottom line of reality. If, on the one hand, one insists on there being such a thing as an objective viewpoint, or an objective truth, objective fact, whatever, it couldn't be everyone's point, but rather that only the observer's view as being objective. Now, the story doesn't end here. An objective viewpoint is not blind to what is happening elsewhere. The observer is obviously aware that there are other viewpoints. The subjective views of people who also themselves have their own objective views. The awareness of others' opinions does not diminish each person's personal feeling, and it certainly doesn't mean that all different versions are accommodated together. If we zoom out, we will see other observers, each of whom will be subjective due to their different locations and thus in different times. If, however, we zoom in, we will find that each person's viewpoint is objective as far as he or she is concerned. It is clear then that all the subjective viewpoints consist of individually objective ones. In other words, each observer is I call it subjectively objective. So when a parent sees their child as the most beautiful or the cleverest or the most whatever, they will swear this opinion is objective. This does not mean, of course, that the parent isn't aware that other parents may think similarly of their own children. The subjective objectivity is a part of nature shared by all observers in their frameworks of language and culture. It allows a window to commonality within this universal whole, where the observer is also the observed. This being the case, any charge of solipsism, the danger of focusing in to the self to the extent that no one else exists, is void. Part and parcel of subjective objectivity is the existence of other people and their views. How am I doing? Not very well. Okay, I've got to speed up. Let me mention the excluded middle. This is the principle of non-contradiction, which is a fundamental law of logic that states that contradictory propositions cannot both be true at the same time. For example, for something to be read and not read at the same time is accepted as logically impossible. Something is either true or false. Aristotle argued that this shows us that we can't think contradictories. So the thought is structured around the basic and fundamental fact that we can't think both P and not P, at least not at the same time. I do not subscribe to this, you may be surprised, not because of the argument that some contradictions are true, but because they simply aren't contradictions when the time element is taken into consideration. It's not that they're illogical, it's that they can't be at the same time. So something cannot be true and false at the same time and place, just as no two things can occur at the same time and place. It is an impossibility and wouldn't exist, not because of logic, because of time. Let me give you a couple of minutes on this thing called a squircle. Okay, a squircle is a square and a circle. So we need to ask whether we really can't imagine a squircle. Actually, we can. For a squircle is a rounded square which has been defined mathematically, apparently, and is used in design and in optics. It consists of a circle within a square and is in effect two components. So a squircle then is a seeming paradox similar to the paradox of the excluded middle. Two things cannot occur at the same time and place. This, as we have already mentioned, is not a paradox, but rather a temporal issue, the impossibility of simultaneity. So how can we even refer to it if it doesn't exist as an entity? But we do refer to it as a combination of two existing items. And so it exists as a notion, a word that describes a superimposed square and a circle, which we can picture helped along by a faux squircle that rounds the corners of a square. But how do we picture it? What we picture is a square and a circle, but not at once. Our eyes flit between one and the other. There's the well-known example of the bird rabbit. You know that wherever you look, you either see a rabbit or a bird. This is the impossibility of seeing two things at once. What we do here, we move from one image to the other. It's not the rabbit duck that we see and therefore exists, but the rabbit or the duck, back and forth. The only non-contradiction is with nothing, with a capital N. Those of you who read my book, Nothing Matters, a book about nothing, I go into this in depth, which I can't now. Nothing being the absence of everything, including ourselves, which is death, the state of being death, not dying, the state of being dead. It's the only event that we need to look at from the outside, because we can't see it from inside because we'd be dead. Everything else that we have mentioned, we can envisage from ourselves being part of it. Not so with death. I'm just going to finish off now by mentioning that paradoxes and contradictions seem to be an integral part of our existence. It is part of what we call intelligence. So what about artificial intelligence? How does AI deal with paradoxes and contradictions? Now listen to the next part, which I will read. AI, including systems like GPT 3.5, generally does not have intrinsic understanding or awareness of paradoxes and contradictions. These systems operate based on patterns and associations learned from vast amounts of data during training. When faced with contradictory statements or paradoxes, AI models may exhibit different behaviors depending on a specific context and the nature of the contradiction. I stopped reading. That last paragraph, what I read, I took from Chat GPT, which informed us of its knowledge of its own shortcomings, which I think is rather cool. Now that is something to ponder over. And now I will allow you to ponder. And Terry, I would not have done anything without mentioning AI, as you realize. So thank you for listening, folks. And now, the first one is the walker. Josh, go for it.
Yes. Well,
that's it. Goodbye. No,
I'm. You gave us a lot to ponder. I was trying to kind of frame your arguments as you were going along, and thinking that I was kind of putting it within a certain pattern, and then as you continued, I had to kind of like scramble that and re-scramble. So I'm still a little bit up in the air. First I was thinking of Hume and Kant, and thinking, well, geez, is he presenting questions and issues that would relate directly to some of what they were, Hume's, questioning sort of, causality and the groundedness of causality. I thought, no, the argument may be more sophisticated than that. And, when you mentioned Hegel, I thought, well, okay, he seems to be presenting a kind, perhaps maybe a post-Hegelian argument where, Hegel wants to tie up these paradoxes or these contradictions in too neat a bow, right? They're all going to be unified at the end, with this wonderful ideal subject that, sits there and is able to ultimately kind of make everything sort of congeal. And it sounded like you were saying, and I certainly would agree with that, that is too, way too simple. And but so, all right. So given that, I guess what I was thinking about or wondering was perhaps the difference between understanding contradictions or paradoxes within within the rules of a science, or within the structure of a particular science, as opposed to how we actually, and this is where I think that your focus on temporality is absolutely fundamental. I think it's key here, because in dealing with other people and dealing with the kinds of paradoxical situations that we do all the time with others, they unfold obviously over time. But that's because we're also changing subtly over time. Our framing, our sense of situations changes. So paradox, we handle paradox all the time, actually, just in terms of our perceptual systems, analyzing the world from within our visual apparatus. I mean, from moment to moment, there's a certain paradox there. We never see the world the same way from moment to moment, but our perceptual systems are on the lookout for constructing stabilities. So I guess my point is that we do, from moment to moment, from day to day, in our relations with other people, we construct sort of stable, overarching, anticipatable worlds that we can interact in. And there are sort of subtle or minute paradoxes that are, in a sense, that stability is built out of those paradoxes. But we keep those paradoxes sort of to a minimum, or I guess we never really, in one sense, were constantly confronted with a world or behavior of other people that presents us with puzzlement and contradiction. But in another sense, there's a certain familiarity and predictability that's an underlying framework there, which is sort of overarching and which sort of allows us to be able to navigate you know that. So it's interesting. So in a sense, there's a sort of paradox about paradox, right?
Correct.
It's two-pronged in that sense.
I agree. Yeah, thank you very much, George.
Yeah.
We'll be able to go on again later. Thank you very much. Yes, paradoxes about paradoxes, and I'm surprised you expected it to be easy. I'm not going to talk about philosophy that everybody else talks about. The whole point. I mean, why would you come here? There's so much better places to go to who want to do that. But I yes. So, Terry.
Fascinating topic. I think I raised my hand specifically in the point when you made, I was going to nitpick. You made a comment about locality and Bell's paradox about Einstein objecting to this non-locality of the wave function. The critical little point that often gets missed in how it's described is you never, ever, ever get an exchange of information. What happens is that when you later, at the speed of light, compare your results, you discover that you cannot explain the correlation without assuming that somehow they were connected. But it can be a subtle point to understand, but it's extremely important in terms of how it works. You cannot send the information that way. You can create a correlation that later on will turn out to be true. But that's not the same thing because you can extract zero information. You can't send a signal. You can't tell the person it's time to do this. You instead change the nature of the reality that will come about for everyone without actually telling anybody anything specific. It's really weird and very hard to kind of get a grasp on. The other comment I'll make on this is fair disclosure to everyone. Ron Green has changed my mind over the years to a degree. And he talks about this subjective objectivity. I think that kind of nails it right there. You can't really have a paradox because you cannot create information until you do a complete loop. You have to send something out, bring it back, and then you compare it to what you is, and then you wind up and saying, oh, this is what I think is going on. That's no small principle. It actually goes down to the depth of space and time in itself, and I don't mean that in a figurative sense. I mean, you cannot define time without sticking your nose and your brain right in the middle of it, because it is, as Einstein noted, extremely relative to what you are. Now, I would phrase that differently. I would call that a gauge symmetry. But everybody can have their, pardon the terminology, but you have a gauge symmetry with respect to distance velocity. That everybody can create their own space and time, but it's only yours, not somebody else's. And that, by the way, is something that's not in most of the literature. The simple equations don't cover that. Your reality competes with somebody else's reality. The universe has been around for a long time, so it's the big, it's the 800-pound gorilla in the book. So he's had a hard time changing it. Talk about the twins paradox. There's a very simple resolution of twins paradox, which is your space and time is a heck of a lot smaller than the universe's. You always lose. If you accelerate, you lose. Go slower. All this mumbo jumbo and incredible convolution doesn't fit with what we actually see experimentally, which is you see something up, it's a satellite, it's particle, it doesn't matter, it slows down, period, story. The trick is that the spaceship also has its own perfectly good definition of space and time. It's just smaller. So when you put things like that, and you get this idea that it's a competitive issue, everybody's trying to get their own objective, definite, subjective objectivity in place, you really wind up saying that you can't define anything without putting yourself in the middle of that definition. I just find it intriguing and a very deep physics property that we need to explore a bit better than it. I'll leave it at that. Anything as far as artificial intelligence, folks, what we're doing now is not artificial intelligence. It's massive retrieval and kleptomania on steroids. And Ron and I have some disagreements now, but this is devastating because this stuff is not smart. It doesn't even have the brain of an infant, but it's very good at stealing ideas. And what happens is, if everybody stops doing creative work, it will just mush that around like some kind of weird dough, and everybody will start getting nonsense, and nobody will have anything useful anymore because all the smarts got erased because everybody's depending on this. This could be catastrophic in areas like software. It's incredibly good if you use this thing for retrieval of software. It is incredibly dangerous if you rely on it and believe that it understands what it's doing, because it doesn't. It doesn't have a mind. It's very, very good at. That's not the same thing. And you can fool you in the short term, but in the long term, it is a catastrophe because you wind up just mushing everything together into nothing. So I'm being blunt about this. This is an issue where, as some of you know, I contributed to the development of the situation. Let's put it that way. So when I say blunt things about artificial intelligence, I'm not speaking from some casual viewpoint. I'm speaking about major parts of my career and what I helped invest in and help promote. I helped promote neural nets at a time when they were kind of on the outs and people were kind of disregarding them. So artificial intelligence concerns me, mostly because people are misunderstanding it. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Terry. You can carry on later, Artifice. Very, very interesting. Thank you very much. Richard, hi there. Richard, can't hear you.
I muted mine in case my coughing disturbed people.
Okay.
So I forgot to unmute it. Yeah, I've got to admit that I went off this morning to ponder this question, and I'd remembered it as being paradoxes and coincidences rather than paradoxes and contradictions. But as I mostly concentrated on paradoxes, I don't suppose it matters much. Anyway, I came to the conclusion that you could split paradoxes into questions where the reasoning is fallacious, or where the answer just is not intuitive to people, or the part which comes to logic and set theory. Now, one of the paradoxes, I'm not a mathematician, so I'm sure that many people here will be able to go into this further and be able to disprove me or say that possibly I've got something. But it seems to me that Russell's paradox, in fact, Bertrand Russell seems to have thought of quite a few paradoxes, and most of them revolve around set theory, logic, and categories. And I really came to the conclusion that from what I could make out, paradoxes all resolve into set theory and problems with set theory, whether something fits within a set or not. And Russell's paradox is possibly the crux of the whole thing. Unfortunately, I don't have the knowledge to go any further about this. And so possibly I am creating a fallacious bit of reasoning myself here. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Richard. Yeah, I was waiting for you to come up with some analytical stuff. I'm sure you'll be back with Wittgenstein and all sorts of stuff. I'm relying on you for that.
Yes, certainly there are paradoxes in literature and linguistics and so on. But, everywhere. But in fact, every discipline that you can look at has paradoxes.
Yep. Yes, part of human condition, I reckon. That's why we're all messed up, and we'll never be not messed up because we'll be full of contradictions forever. But anyway, thank you very much, Michael. How you doing?
Hi. It's such a huge topic, and unfortunately, I have to leave soon for another event, but just a couple of comments. I appreciate your example of this squircle, which is a hybrid between square and a circle, because this is what we are using in our research to represent the metric which combines two or more, three, several different metrics. And these metrics could result in sort of contradiction because something which is best according to one of these metrics is not necessarily the best according to another metric. And this squircle is a mathematical expression that allows to balance these different metrics and derive the combined metric that could be used as, to find the optimal value, for instance. So it's a really useful way to deal with these contradictions in mathematics.
Yeah, I the chart.
Oh,
And I also appreciate your reference to Hegel and what you called subjective objectivity. Probably is the same thing that I prefer to call subjective materialism. Because as you probably know, what the Hegel theory represents the objective idealism, which is opposite to subjective idealism of Berkeley, this known also as solipsism, according to which there is nothing else other than our subjective experience, and that's it. But my view of this that there is probably something behind our subjective experience, but the only way how we can understand this something is from our subjective experiences. So this is a kind of foundation of our understanding of the world, and all contradictions arise from the fact that our subjective experiences or the observers are different. If you have two observers of the same thing, you would have different observations and you would potentially have a paradox. And Hegel's idea of the synthesis of these contradictions could be probably understood as the way how the larger systems can be composed of smaller systems. So you can have subsystems or elements representing different observers who have different views, and I am not necessarily talking about conscious observers. I am talking about observers as physical systems. And they still can compose a larger system, which becomes a new observer, and that can somehow reconcile these contradictions. But interact with other systems, and that would result in a new set of contradictions. And for us, for people, this is an equivalent of somehow exchanging our subjective experiences in the form of language, in the form of social communication, of shared beliefs, and forming these larger groups, societies, and so on. So somehow there is this natural way of resolving these contradictions that Hegel described in idealistic terms, but there could be some objective, as you call it, this, or materialistic correlate of this dialectic and very deep dialectic idea of resolving these contradictions. So there is much more about this, but for the sake of time, let me stop at it.
Lots more. Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you. Victor.
Okay, so I would say that there's this binarism in the notion of a contradiction and the notion of paradox that I think we've done much in philosophy to try to escape from. Nonetheless, it recurs, right, eternally almost. So I think the simplest form of it is irony, where the contradiction is implicit. The ironic phrase says itself and unsays itself implicitly. You have places in the US where they speak with such a flat voice that the listener is simply does not perceive the irony in the phrase, for instance. So it's a matter of tone. There's the verbal irony, and then there's also, of course, the situational irony. I think alongside that, before the paradox, you have alongside of it, you have antinomy, the antinomies of Kant, particularly the four antinomies of Kant, and there you brought in the issues of space and time. He proves he proves the thesis, right, and then he proves the antinomy, what is the opposite of that thesis. And I think what he, or perhaps this is what I wish, he seems to assert by pride of place. The second, the antithesis, is what he's actually a proponent of to a degree. I think that is how the mind of Kant is working. Okay, then we have all the paradoxes, the liar, the sorties, the grandfather paradox, Russell, and all of that. And then Hegel's dialectic is some kind of resolution of it, but it's all inadequate, the Hegelian dialectic for me, because it ignores what is most fascinating in the paradox, for instance. What's most fascinating in the opposition is the insolubilia. It's the stuttering effect. It's the fact that you called it flipping from side to side, right? It's this stuttering effect that the mind never settles on one or the other. And what all of this leaves out, with all of this binarism, even with a Hegelian, Aufhebung, a resolution of it, is spectra, rhizomes, Heraclitean flux, difference. All of that is left out, and we're sort of locked into an old mode of thinking. That doesn't mean that I'm not fascinated by paradoxes. I am. I'm incessantly because I think they're in the structure of the psyche itself, which I think that philosophers like Lyotard don't shy away from this issue. But if you look at Lacan's idea of the real, in Lacan, the real is the impossible. It's the inconceivable. It is the remainder of reality that cannot be expressed. Okay, versus the real as we see it, which we can never know because we do not know the thing in itself, right? So the real almost serves the purpose in Lacan as the thing in itself, the inconceivable. All right, and we have another version of this in for the psyche in Sartre, which is the notion of bad faith, right? Which can be related to the liar's paradox, because in bad faith there is no unconscious, there is no immaculate repression into the unconscious. There is a particle of the self that knows that that the self is lying to itself. And then there's this immense portion of the self that does not know it, right? So there is this kind of stuttering effect between the lie that is known and the lie that is unknown. And as a result of that, there is not a repression, but vanishing. There's a vanishing into the lie, right? Okay, the thing remains unknown. Okay, so I started out with this description. I mean, I meant to perhaps start with the issue of spectra, rhizomes, Heraclitean flux and difference. But I started out with irony because irony is so basic to language. It's so basic to wit. It's so basic to aphorism, to literature. And one has in, as far as these reflections on the nature of time and space, these sort of cosmological thinking, which you and others were engaging in, there is, perhaps the author of authors in the 19th century in France is Flaubert. And Flaubert's project, in my mind, was the ironic sublime. So he visited the pyramid with this friend, and at the summit of the pyramid, he found this card of a ruiné businessman, right? So at the summit of, in Hegel's aesthetics, you have the pyramid and the ziggurat are the two most privileged forms of architecture, which are at the center of all of Flaubert's tales and novels, literally at the center, at the precise center. Okay, and in one tale of Flaubert, he transforms this idea, this aesthetic idea, into his most perfect realization of the ironic sublime, the self-annihilation of the absolute work. At the absolute center of the tale, it's 34 pages, on the fold between the 17th and 18th page, you have John the Baptist. He's at the paginal center. He's at the spatial center of the tale, at the summit of a helical cone-shaped peak, and that looks onto the Holy Land. And he's at the temporal center. It's a tale that begins at dawn and that ends at dawn. He is there he appears at noon. And at noon, and he's at the center of also the vertical axis, because in the constellation Algol, you will have there's a dark star that circles a white star every 3 days. That eclipse is the beheading of John the Baptist. He's at the summit, at the apex of the helical cone-shaped peak, and at the end of the tale, he descends into the underworld to announce the coming of Christ. He's everywhere on the vertical, and he's everywhere on the horizontal, because at the end of the tale, it says his voice will be heard to the ends of the earth. It's this extreme form of spatial ambition. The maximum is in the minimum, and the minimum is in all things. And at the summit, at the center of the tale, at the center of time, at the center of space, the voice of John rises for the first time, and it says, the walls will crumble. Remember, he's in a walled city. The walls will crumble, the city shall burn, and the scourge of the Lord will never cease. He shall scatter the morsels of your flesh on the mountains. So he has figured St. John as the God of Spinoza. St. John is in all things. He's prefigured in everything in the landscape, and his voice of annihilation from the book of Isaiah rises. This is what I call the ironic sublime. He's trying to write in each instance the perfect sentence, but the sentence ends by being ironic. So the absolute sentence unwrites itself, it unsays itself, and the entire tale tries at the cosmological level to express perfect spatial relations on an axis mundi, and with an imago mundi, and temporally a 1-day cycle, 3-day cycle, monthly, yearly, historical and cosmological cycle are all expressed through this figure. And then there's an annihilation. So it's the perfect expression in a work of literature of a paradoxical structure, right? Of an antinomial structure, and there's a shattering. So the shattering, in a sense, goes beyond the mere stuttering of the effect.
Thank you very much, Victor. You can carry on later. Everybody's got to have. Thank you very, very much. That's very, very interesting. Please come back later, and you can carry on. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Very interesting. Do you folk mind if I let in Don, because he's new, and it'd be, I think, nice if he came in now. Is that all right with you all? Moshe, is that okay?
Yeah, just get me afterward.
Yes, of course, of course. Don, welcome. I can't hear you. Don?
Where's Don?
I'm sorry. I had my microphone off. I apologize. I also have a cough, but hopefully I'll get through this without coughing. Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a topic of special interest to me, particularly the issue of contradiction. I had something I was going to say, and if I have time, I had two examples, but my first inclination is something of a meta statement, a commentary on what I've heard so far, and I'm new to this group. But one thing that interests me is that I hear a variety of disciplinary discourses or languages, and which would include physics, mathematics, in the fields of in the areas of philosophy, generally speaking, both analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, psychoanalysis, and I'm sure there are others, maybe systems theory. And I've always been an advocate for and a believer in what I call transdisciplinary, not interdisciplinary, because I think inter is an embarrassed prefix, which is basically functioning to preserve some notion of the integrity of disciplines. I believe in discipline. I think that the disciplines, the objectification through institutional processes and entities of disciplines is a problem for us in trying to talk about the kinds of things we're trying to talk about here and in other venues. So we need to find ways of one of the things that I find frequently is that relevant contexts in various disciplinary discourses or languages, relevant contexts are excluded for the sake of some notion of precision. And it involves oversimplification and basically reification of actual contradictions. Coming to the issue of contradiction, of actual contradictions that are one person suggested, the term objective is not good, but we should think of a material. Or if we're going to talk about material, then I think we have to understand material and materialism, not in terms of entity object, primarily relations, but in terms of relations, and that means social relations, at least in human. Well, actually, I would say also now we're beginning to recognize that animals that non-human species engage socially and collectively and problem solving and that kind of thing. Somebody mentioned problem solving in the chat. What I'm getting at is that I think the way in which we try to talk about these things are still stuck in our respective disciplinary formations. And in the process, we're often talking to ourselves, or we're talking in we're basically living in silos and communicating to those that share our particularly disciplinary formations. The two examples I was going to take were issues that are very important currently. One has been frequently referred to, and that's artificial intelligence. The other is diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'd like to, if I have the time, can I use those two examples, or would you rather I stop here and I can come back later and do that?
Do you mind coming back later? Is that okay
I
with you?
I don't mind coming
Thank
back
you
later.
very much. Very noble of you, because everybody wants to have a few words. Thank you. You'll come back. Good. Excellent. Moshe. Hi.
Hello. Well, my response to what you to your my response is going to be not to bite from the apple, but simply to deny the dogmatic sophistry that you engaged in, and assert that there is complete certainty in the world. And I brought this up a year or so ago when I had a talk with you. You were talking about approximate knowledge, and I brought up the counterexample of the tax man who says that you owe so much in in sales tax or income tax or something like that. And there's nothing approximate about that. From a practical standpoint, you do, and if you don't pay it, you go to jail, and that's that. And if they put a fine on it, it's not an approximate fine; it's an absolute fine. It's completely, it's completely certain. So, what I want to say is that both, if we take this, if we take a look at my position of absolute certainty and your position as absolute certainty as two dogmas, I mean, the person who's going to have the last laugh here, the person who's going to be coming out on top is going to be the person who's still online after everybody else leaves the meeting. Because both of these propositions, that there's either is complete certainty or that there is nothing but subjective, what do you call it, subjective objectivity or subjectively objective, are both deniable, are both false propositions that can be false. So that being the case, what we would have to do would be to find a way to make one of these sets of propositions or some other set of propositions true. But I want to suggest that the way of doing that, and because it's your show and not my show, and I'm not going to take the 30 minutes to do it, is to deny what you're saying completely and say we have to look in another direction and not go into this, not go into the middle of what you're saying and trying to deny it internally, because that won't get you anywhere. It just gets you into the to the lovely circles that we've been listening to here. So my response to you is no, there are no paradoxes and there are no contradictions. There's complete certainty in the world, and we can know that, and we live in that world, and we're all happy to do it. And when I get up in the morning, I do stand on the floor beneath my feet. Thank you, Ronald. I'll talk to you later.
Regarding taxes, actually, if you have a good accountant, you will see that it's not at all certain what your taxes are. And
it is after he's finished with it.
Two different accountants will argue about what is real, about the real tax you're supposed to pay. So I still haven't found reality in the world, but it's good. It's good that you're looking for it. It's good. It's good. It's fine. Thank you. Thank you very much, Moshe. I know you're going to come back. I know. Thank you very much.
I'll be back.
Claudio, how are you doing?
Oh, fine, thank you. Yes. I'll try to keep this short. I'll try to do it in less than 2 hours. Okay. No. Anyway, yeah. So I believe in contradictions and paradoxes, although many of our paradoxes are due to our limited knowledge and our experience in the macro world. You mentioned death. A lot of people, that's could be a contradiction for a lot of people. They live like they're gonna live forever, or many of them live as if they're gonna live. They're gonna reach the age of 100 or in their 90s, and rather than prepare themselves, because for death, which is inevitable, right? The mortality rate on Earth is 100%. Everyone dies. But we rarely spend time thinking about death, preparing ourselves or our loved ones to make death, when it finally arrives, more comfortable and be less fearful, make it less of a frightening experience, the process of dying and then finally dying, right? But hardly anybody does that. And although it can be very beneficial to prepare oneself for that time when it comes, because we don't know when our number is going to come up. At any time, there's so many things that can kill us. Look what's happening in the Ukraine, in the Middle East. Look what happened to the 6 million innocent Jews during the Holocaust. Like they just are, you know. And you have the most extreme form of contradictions. I like history, so I want to mention some contradictions of the Nazis. Hitler, the Nazis believed that they were a superior race, and hence they went on conquering other lands. They felt that they were privileged to do that because they were the superior race according to their social Darwinist beliefs. But then at the end of the war, when Hitler realized that the war was lost, they were on the verge of losing, he says, well,
Darwinists.
who's speaking there?
We'll put us back on.
Yeah, the Germans, then he said that, because the Germans are losing the war, they're going to lose. They are inferior to the Allied powers. So there was and he also contradicted his perception of the Jews. He saw them as an inferior race or nationality, and he used all kinds of derogatory metaphors. But he was aware, though, that the Jews, 50% of the doctors in many German cities were Jewish. 22% of the Nobel Prize winners, Nobel laureates, are Jewish, yet they comprise 0.2% of the world's population. And those awards were started being handed out in 1902, right? Also, he saw the Jews as the copiers of culture and science, not the originators. Yet he claimed that the Jews were both the authors and founders of new ideologies such as Bolshevism and capitalism. He saw them as influencing all parts of not only Germany's culture, economy, and politics, but the whole world. So that doesn't sound like they were an inferior race. That sounds like they were superior, right? But that's a contradiction. Then also, just very quickly, I mentioned the macro world, our experience in the macro world. So there's a lot of paradoxes in the once people started studying the stars and the micro world. Like, for example, I'll just give you an example. Electromagnetism, which is smaller than gravity, covers a smaller area, right? It keeps together quantum particles, is exceedingly more powerful than gravity, which covers a larger space. It covers the entire universe. It's 10 to the power 36 times stronger. So, like what humans believe that bigger is stronger, it's kind of like a paradox there. It's that proves that it's false. And then the splitting of the atom, something small, which destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That mass that was converted to energy, that mass was exceedingly smaller than a baby aspirin. So smaller can be much more powerful than And then you mentioned simultaneous events, right? Finally, that it seems like a paradox. How can two events occur simultaneously? Yet you have many scientists believe that light behaves both as a particle and wave simultaneously, right? Wave-particle duality. So there is a paradox there. And objects also can be described as both wave and particle. Well, that's existence, though, right? And then you have alternative histories. Many scientists believe that every possible version of the universe exists simultaneously in quantum superposition. So I just listed a few, paradoxes and contradictions, and then you could also add free will to that, right? If the illusion of free will is actually true, right, that's a paradox because for most of us, we feel that all of our decisions are free, right? You have qualia, right? So I'll stop it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudio. Hi there, Bill.
Hi there.
As I'm listening to this, I want to bring an experience of context to it. I spend a great deal of time, thinking about my big choices. And I've done it professionally for a long time, and I do it now. When I sit down and talk to myself about my choices, I'm thinking about the consequences of them. And occasionally along the way, I find that I'm confronted with contradictions and paradoxes. And when I get there, they tell me that my choice may be a bad one, present unacceptable risks, and be just downright stupid. And so when I want to do something about my choice, I modify it on the basis of the contradictions and the paradoxes and the unacceptable risks to make it sensible for me to go forward or stop. But the sense I have is that this is a common distillation of what I understand to be Karl Popper's idea of falsification. It's the idea that we look at our consequences in terms of whether they're bad or risky or put us in a situation where we have to get out of it. And that I find everywhere in my work. As a lawyer, I find it in, the stupidity of Anton Scalia in his judgment that the Second Amendment creates an unrestricted right to own weapons and therefore created a whole regime of mass murder. That's a contradiction in vision of the Constitution as creating a more perfect union instead of a slaughter mill. And he sat there and said, well, that was a great thing because I want to preserve the right of people to bear arms. And that wasn't what it was all about at all. It was a prohibition against Congress to interrupt the right of people to have a militia, which they wouldn't have under the system that was there. So, paradox and contradictions are very informative about the quality of our thoughts and the issues of falsification and how we should change our bad judgments into good ones. Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting, Bill. Thank you very much. Thank you. Where are we? Roland. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi.
Yeah.
Very interesting discussion as always. Yeah, I've got a couple of points that I wanted to mention. As Bill just mentioned his take on it, this is something that I quite strongly agree with. To me, there's a parallel between paradox and the mathematical concept of reduction to absurdity, which, you start off with an equation and then you progressively apply rational steps to it until you reach something which is quite clearly true or something that is quite clearly false, like 1 = 1 or 1 = 2. And if you get an absurdity, having conducted a series of rational steps, then you know that your original starting point was flawed. And I think paradox is basically exactly that. It's like arriving at an absurdity, which then tells you that something you've done in your reasoning process or in the assumptions that you've used is inconsistent, contradictory, doesn't make sense. And I found that in a lot of the, well, in fact, all of the sort of famous paradoxes that I've come across. This is exactly what's going on. There's some assumption that is being made in the terms of the paradox, which is inconsistent, and therefore you get a paradoxical answer. So that's I think the nature of paradox, and so I agree. The untangling of paradox is very much about the examination of the process that led to that paradox and the assumptions made that appear to make the paradox sensible when it isn't. But there was a couple of other things I wanted to say. I agree with Richard's observation that a lot of these things come down to set theory. And I think there's a good reason for it, because I remember when I was at school, I don't know, I was probably about 5 or 6 or something, when I was first introduced to Venn diagrams. And I remember thinking it was fantastic that you could actually represent things with just a circle on a piece of paper and then two circles intersecting, and then this idea of the thing in the middle, the intersection of these two circles, actually representing something that had the properties of the. I thought it was just a fantastic idea, and so easy to understand that even a child of 5 can understand it. So I think the reason why set theory is so powerful an idea is that it very closely mirrors the way in which we combine categories and think about hierarchies. But obviously, Russell discovered this big problem with set theory, with his paradox, and that created mayhem. But I feel that there is a reason why that version of set theory has a problem, and it's because of the way in which it's conceived. With sets, you have the idea of a set and members of a set, but this creates an objectivity. You have the idea, for example, of the set of all oranges. Well, you then objectified all the oranges, and that's not how we work. We don't work on the basis of having knowledge or modeling knowledge of everything that is, that exists. It doesn't make any sense. If set theory was couched in a different way, so that you refer instead to events of observation rather than members of a set, all these problems vanish, because you no longer, Russell's set paradox no longer works. At the point where you turn the idea of membership of a set into events of observation, at that point you've brought the observer back into set theory rather than objectifying it, and suddenly it all works. So having said that, I wanted to move on to Ron, your observation about squircles, which you almost certainly thought that I would pick up on, I'm sure. So the idea of a square circle. Now, I think set theory models this beautifully, because you have the set of squares, you have the set of circles, and what have you got in the middle? You've got null. Okay, you could say, well, I'll have a rounded rectangle, but that's not a square or a circle. It's a hybrid which requires changing the criteria of a circle and a square in order to get anything in it. So if you now think of the idea of the set of events of observing squares and events of observing circles, it's quite obvious that the overlap can contain nothing. There is no predictable event that could have both at the same time. That produces a very interesting effect, because the nature of set theory is to distinguish between the set and the member. Now, that distinction is absolutely critical, I think, in understanding why the Russell's set paradox appeared to work. And I mean, paradoxes like the Barber's paradox, same principle, is the confusion between the member of a set and the set itself. And with the squircle, this becomes much more obvious, because you can talk about a squircle, as you quite rightly said, but you can't talk about anything in the intersection of the set of squares and the set of circles, because there isn't anything there. So the only reason you can talk about a squircle is because you can talk about the two intersecting sets. So you're not talking about membership of that intersection. You're talking about the sets themselves. And the same thing you can do that actually as an experiment. Here is a pen. So I can say, I am this pen I'm holding right now, here is a pen. And now if I put my pen behind my computer here, I can say there is a pen behind my computer. Now those are two completely different things, because in the one where I'm holding the pen, I'm experiencing it now. It's happening now. It's here right now. I can see it. So there is a process of identifying the experience with my understanding of a pen. If I put it here so I can't see it anymore, then that pen is not happening now. It is a pen that might be there, almost certainly is there because I've literally just put it there, but I can't tell whether it's there until I pick it up. And this to me, it indicates the basis of testability, because if you can't distinguish between conceiving of something and instantiating that conception as an experience, then you can't test anything. That's a vital aspect of testability. So that distinction allows us to create sets of criteria that are actually impossible to instantiate. So we can create the set of, all oranges and all things that are not orange and intersect them and talk about the thing in the middle. We can even give it a name, a non-orange. It doesn't really matter because all we've done is we've identified an area of two sets overlapping and said there's nothing in it. So if we can make this distinction between the criteria and the instance of those criteria happening, then this problem of identifying the testability of something just vanishes. So I think those were the only those are the only points I really wanted to make. But I felt that this issue about sets is absolutely central to this whole issue of paradoxes, and bringing the observer back into it kind of, I think actually I don't know whether it's been done at all, but if someone actually took that to heart and started to develop a theory that was based on bringing the observer back into set theory, I think it would be pretty cool. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roland. Thank you. Very interesting. Thank you. James.
Oh, hi. Thank you.
Were you there when I mentioned the thing in chat about truth and untruth? I don't think you.
No, I missed it. No, go ahead. Tell me what you said.
It was your moment of glory, which you missed.
I'm sorry.
I said that in the chat a month ago, you said if there's truth, there must be untruth, and I mentioned that. That was right in the beginning, and I mentioned that, and I said that is true, but that's a contradiction, and it moved me on to talk about those sort of things. So right. I picked that up when I was looking through the chat, and I found that very interesting. Anyway, so
okay, no, I'll find it later. Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to mention Hegel. I think this is really interesting. I loved some of the things that people brought up, and I just wanted to mention Hegel because he kind of like dovetails into the discussion about set theory. Hegel basically said that in the objective look of things, there's basically there's a dialectic between the individuality of the object, or rather, the sense in which it has its own properties and is not simply the designed aspect of it, but rather its existence as a phenomenon. And at the same time, there is the set, the existence in which something that something has. So, or that something has as a genus or a class. In Aristotle's words, genus. Just a second, I think someone's at the door. I'm gonna check that.
I closed and locked the door. Nobody can get in here.
No.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm your neighbor upstairs.
Yeah.
Yesterday they crashed my car. Did you see it?
Okay, this is
No,
interesting.
no, I'm sorry. I'll let you know. Are you in 202? 212?
No, I'm right here. I'm upstairs.
You're upstairs, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Okay, I know where you are. Yeah. Okay, if I remember anything, I'll let you know, but I didn't see anything.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. So anyway, yeah, it was an emergency, I guess. She had her car damaged. Anyway, yeah, so the two ways of perceiving things are always going to kind of like run parallel to each other. There's the known existence of, say, photons and what we know of the behavior of photons. And then there's the fact that every photon has its own story, its own life, and that's going to the objective view is always going to be a little bit different from the from what we what we would necessarily expect. So this idea that all these differences between things, right? All the differences that cause one set of photons to be different from another set of photons, or one set of apples to be different from another set of apples, and so forth. These are all kinds of these are basically these paradoxes are kind of like a product of nature itself. The fact that, and people have talked about it, they exist in space and time. And there's always going to be this double-edged paradox of things belonging to a description or belonging to a set and things being outliers. And it's not, what the paradoxes are is kind of like just a conscious awakening to the fact that we cannot describe things simply by a single list of their properties, because that only reflects the particular look that we're giving at a particular time, in a particular instance, for a particular subject, as you were saying, Ron, in quoting Leibniz. So that's all. It's just a Hegel basically discussed all that and said this all belongs to a fact that we have to look at things two different ways. We have to look at their individuality, always have to look at their actual individual outcomes, and those are not defined by what we describe them as being according to a set definition, if I can use that word. That the set definition is not necessarily describe what the life or the path of an individual is, whether we're talking about individuals in the sense of sentient beings, or we're talking about individuals in the sense of objects. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And can I just talk about Hegel for a second?
Could I also just talk about Hegel for a second?
Yes,
certainly.
Definitely.
Dialectics. Thank you. No, you go for. I just wanted to give a footnote on what James said.
Okay.
Yeah, you go first, Ron.
No, I just wanted to say that it's okay looking at things from different sides. I'm all for that. Hegel said that when you do that and you put them together, you're going to come to a conclusion, and that is problematic to me, because I don't think that putting two opposites together, the sun will come up and you realize that, oh, this is it. I've now solved things. I don't see how that works. And
well, he doesn't say it's a conclusion. That's a distortion of Hegel's thinking. He says that it informs us of both sides of that particular existence. To know what AI is, we have to look at it dialectically. To know what physics is at the quantum level, we have to look at it dialectically, and so on.
Okay, but okay, I will stay and disagree. We'll talk about this another time, I'm sure. But okay, thank you very much. Thank you, James. Yes, Don, you wanted to say. One second. Is it okay, Olga, if I let if Don says his thing for a
I'll
second?
keep it very brief.
Okay. Okay, Don, and then Olga.
Olga, is it all right with you?
Olga, can you hear?
Of course, it's all right.
Yeah, but we have to ask.
James used the word that for the first time in this conversation, in this discussion, and it's the word dialectics in relation to Hegel. And I just want to say a word about dialectics. I think the law of non-contradiction in propositional logic, while it has a major function in scientific research and in a lot of the disciplines and the social sciences that are based in part on propositional logic in some ways, that it also is a problem because it basically excludes what is fundamental in Hegel's philosophy. And a philosopher friend of mine has also identified a connection between Hegel and Darwin in this regard, as that has to do with emergence, adaptation, and evolutionary evolution, natural selection. And it's Bill Rothschild. If any of you, some of you are philosophers, you may know him. Bill Rothschild is the philosopher who wrote about this. Anyway, my point is that dialectics. I have an ongoing debate now with a Marxist who's an analytic philosopher, who tells me that the dialectics is not a logic, and I think that's wrong. I think dialectics is a form of logic. It's a different form of logic. It's a complementary form of logic to analytic or propositional logic. But one of the problems with the ways in which we use propositional logic, or even I would say certain aspects of linguistic theory, where we restrict communication just to the individual sentence as a unit, is that it's very restrictive. And what is being restricted are excluded relevant contexts, which there's even a term in continental philosophy. Bracketing is a way of doing that for the sake of a certain notion of precision. So I just want to say that I think dialectics is a logic. Now, my Marxist friend insists that dialectics in Marx is only a descriptive, empirical function, but not a logic. And I think that's nonsense. If you've read Capital, it's a very, very logical structure of argumentation built on dialectics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Don. Olga, thank you for being so patient.
Thanks. Okay, so I usually wait until someone mentions something that I would like to talk about. And you actually mentioned it about art, and of course, if we talk about art and poetry, and then Victor said about irony. And of course, humor and irony, and especially sarcasm, they are on the edge. They are kind of paradoxical by creation, by definition. And they created usually to describe and reveal paradox. And but now, for example, I'm not sure how it's in other countries, but in the United States, it's already not possible to be sarcastic. You will be considered to be rude, and that's it. And even in very famous sitcom, South Park, you probably know about it, they already several years ago, they said that we live in post-humor society, that society that try to get rid of paradoxes, try to make everything serious and meaning what is said. But is it actually possible? And for example, just recently, I was invited to lecture here in New York in very known space of Simon Foundation. They have scientific lectures, and the title of this lecture is Understanding How Biological Cells Self-Organize into Organs and Organisms. So the title is actually saying about biological cells that self-organizing. So does it mean that every cell has notion of self, or it's just metaphor? And at that point, we come to this notion of metaphor that actually created to resolve these paradoxes. But and paradox in itself, when we compare two things that not actually comparable and from different, let's say, of different sets of things or whatever. So, and after that, it's probably became very obvious there is nothing is possible without paradox. It just, they are, maybe say they are on different levels, different type of paradoxes. And for example, again, it's example from the poetry. It's Russian poet of 19th century. He said that in one of his famous, again, poems, his name is Tuchev, he said that any thought that is said is a lie. So is it also, this is also a metaphor. This is also a lie, what he is saying. And of course, if I start to try to, whatever proof is, to try to prove that nothing is possible without paradox, nothing is said possible without paradox, nothing is done possible without paradox, then it takes too much time. But what I wanted to say, there is nothing is possible without paradox, and everything that we say is metaphor, which is itself is paradox. That's it. Thanks.
Yeah, very, very good point. Yeah, thank you very much, Olga. Thank you.
Actually, one more small thing. It's about fences in Great Britain and the United States. I could comment also on that, but it will take probably a couple of minutes if you would like.
Okay.
Okay. But if only you see, yes, these fences that you said that in individualistic society it should be also fenced. Everywhere should be these fences and dividers. But it's also not also. You see, this is comparably new social structure compared to Great Britain. Great Britain is developed during many centuries. Here in history of United States, it's not so long. And this is also about control. I don't know if you, and it's actually total control, because you probably know that if you plant something in your backyard, it could be illegal in some places. and you could go to court and fine for this. So you should be always open. It's kind of community would like to control what is happening in your home, in your backyard. It's also long discussion. It could be long discussion about it, why it happened and why it happened in United States and what reason, but it's kind of new rules how society should be constructed. In Soviet Union, for example, was different new rules how control could be conducted. You see, here in the United States, it's one of the tools of control that you have to have open backyard. You should show everyone what you're doing there. And you could not even plant a bush or a tree without particular no approval. That's it. Thanks.
Oh, that is definitely interesting. Thank you very much. Bruno, hi there.
Hi. In my naive opinion, in the real world, the one made of matter, energy, space and time, there are no contradictions, in the sense that the world is what it is, and what exists cannot be considered impossible or not existing. Contradictions do exist only in the realm of information, in the sense that we may be confronted with contradictory sets of information. This occurs when a set of information that claims to describe a reality does not really properly describe it. The reason for the discrepancy is usually the fact that the real world is much more complex than the map we draw of it by means of information. So if a discourse is contradictory, it means that some parts of it are inaccurate or incomplete with respect to the reality it claims to be describing. In other words, the contradictory or paradoxical discourse is too simple or fallacious. If you see any contradiction or paradox in what I just said, you may be right. However, the portion of the world I tried to describe is not in itself contradictory. My map of it may be so. That's it for me.
I'm forced to answer that. You've taken out knowledge. You've taken out epistemology completely. You're talking about something that we don't talk about, because when we talk about it's contradictory. So you're saying it doesn't exist, and where doesn't it exist? For whom doesn't it exist when we're talking about it, when we know about it? I don't know what your real world is if we don't have knowledge of it. And as soon as we have knowledge of it, we're in the middle of contradiction, which was contradiction.
Well, I spoke of information.
For whom?
Knowledge is based on information.
Okay, for whom?
It's not based on reality. It's not based on physical things. It's based on information. Information is not material.
Yeah.
It's immaterial.
Yeah,
and
okay.
Epistemology falls in the realm of information.
Okay. Information for whom?
For anybody who creates it, or receive it anyone who's concerned by it.
Okay.
So the source or the receiver of it.
For observers.
I would rather say the producer and the consumer of information.
Observers.
Observing is not necessarily when you observe something, you do not necessarily create information. You receive a sensation, and then you do what you want with it. But this does not necessarily imply a creation of information. Observation is something, it's a different phenomenon.
You do see my problem, right? I'm not being,
I don't see your problem.
Okay, that is problematic for a start, because whereas you're imparting information, are you not?
Any discourse, any language is based on information.
Okay.
It's made of information, built in a given way, with a given form.
But you do, what I'm saying is that information is somewhere, and it's somewhere, meaning that observers can receive it. Otherwise, what is information? For whom?
Information is in the memory of people, and in the where information can be stored and transmitted or communicated
to
anyone.
Correct. Yeah.
So what is the problem?
The problem is that once it's communicated, the people are receiving it, and the trouble begins, because they're arguing about it, and
Of course there is trouble with information, but and I said contradiction and paradoxes are related to information. Information can be contradictory, not the world, not reality. Information itself is usually too simple and fallacious and contradictory, not the world.
Okay. Okay, fair enough.
You know the saying, the map is not the territory. So we have to distinguish the territory from the map. The territory is there, and it's not contradictory. It's simply there. But then we have to create maps in order to describe it and to communicate it. But the map can be wrong. The map can be incomplete. It can be contradictory, not the territory.
But the territory is there for us to see, whether we draw maps or not. There is a territory. If you tell me there's nobody in the universe, but there's territory, that's our sticking point.
Yes, but there is no problem of contradiction in that case, because there's no one who talks about it.
Correct. So we agree on that. Okay.
The contradiction starts when we start talking about something.
When there are people.
Yeah, who talks about things?
Yeah, okay. That's the problem.
So we should concentrate on language, as Wittgenstein used to say.
Language which is always used by people. Always.
Yeah, we are using language right now.
Okay.
And the problems are all in the language, not anywhere else.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Most welcome.
It's okay if we disagree, right?
Of course it is okay.
Okay. Thank you very much.
But it would be nice to agree on what we disagree. That would be nice.
I agree with that as well.
Right. And I'm not sure we agree on what we disagree. I'm not sure about that.
Only because we're both here agreeing and disagreeing. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing any of it. That's my point. But anyway, we can continue somewhere else. But thank you very much. That was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Who was next? Where are we? Victor.
I think I was
who
here.
Who? Josh?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Okay. Sorry, I didn't. No, fair enough. You're still walking. Fair enough. You're gonna tire yourself out. Go.
Okay. Thanks.
Sorry.
Yeah, I want to start with a quick summary of what we've heard so far. Not surprisingly, it's from the gamut from the direct realists who posit the real world out there, and we have direct access to it, and all we have to do is it should be a fairly simple matter of getting the facts straight. And then we have those that say, well, all right, there is that world out there that just sits there waiting for us to understand it, but the problem is in our interpretation of it. So it's a little bit more complicated getting our facts straight because we have to deal with how to talk to each other so that we can be on the same page. Then we have the Hegelian Marxists that say, well, no, it's there's not a world sitting out there independent of us that we then simply have to correspond or map our conceptions onto. We kind of synthesize or develop. The world sort of develops through us or with us, as there's this dialectical progression or development. And so, they throw in a bit of relativism there, and you can see how paradox, in the case of the Hegelians, is no longer simply a matter of our, bumbleheaded failure to use precise, concise mathematical language to describe that pristine world, which just sits there waiting for us to map it out. For the Hegelians and the Marxists, it's the paradox is sort of built in to a certain extent within sort of the dialectical movement, the oppositional movement. There's going to be this lurching kind of surprise from era to era, but it will all work itself out for the Hegelians. Now, there were a couple, I think Victor mentioned rhizomes, and I heard it maybe there's a reference there to Deleuze. But so there are certain segments within philosophy that make this statement. They say the history of philosophy was stuck on a metaphysical assumption that paradox is something bad and something to be eliminated somehow or other. We eliminate it through correct correspondence of our ideas to a pre-existing, independently existing world, or we get rid of paradox ultimately through Hegelian dialectic. But one way or the other, paradox, negation, contradiction, ultimately are considered to be accidents or secondary, a means to an end. Unification becomes the end. So that was a long-standing sort of aim within philosophy. So within these alternative approaches, post-structuralism, postmodernism, deconstruction, phenomenology, paradox is no longer something secondary, something to be afraid of or swept under the rug. Or so within given that, I think that one can talk about two different notions of paradox. One is a relatively trivial notion. So let's say one's working within a mathematical or an empirical realm, and one comes upon a paradox. If it's one that one can resolve by tweaking one's definitions or conceptions or changing one's criteria of sets, that's what I call a trivial paradox. But I think that misses a much more profound issue, which is that those trivial paradoxes are subsets or manifestations or expressions of a much deeper notion of paradox. And that is when we truly shift a perspective, say within a science, say, in Kuhn's sense, right, from one paradigmatic notion of understanding to another, we're confronted with a paradox which is much more profound, and I think is much more revealing in terms of what it tells us about how our relation to the world is constructed fundamentally. So these paradoxes cannot be resolved through any kind of a mathematical framework. I mean, that's anathema, because the whole basis of a mathematics is that it has to have in front of it certain defined notions that sit there waiting for it to be used by that mathematical scheme. The mathematics can go back to it, the definition of a set, or either the contents of the set or the set itself, or the criteria. The notion there is that we can, place these things as quote unquote observers. We can place them, set them in front of us, and then construct a model and then use that model. But what all this misses is what makes paradox fundamental. And I think Olga touched upon this, and that is, this is to return to the Wittgenstein, the later Wittgenstein, not the early Wittgenstein of the Tractatus, but the later Wittgenstein, where language isn't the problem. Well, language is only the problem when we assume that language gives us access to things as they are, that language is just a tool that we use in order to, attach it, to ground ourselves to what is out there. Wittgenstein pointed out that what language does tells us about the fundamental way in which we understand ourselves within the world, and that is we use language in terms of our interactions with each other. So, and through those interactions, we're creating the meanings that we're using on the fly as we go along.
Josh, could I say something? I wanted to say, he had named me as the person to speak, and I have a disabled roommate that I need to take care of. It's
go ahead.
Could I possibly make my comment?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Right. So this is something that, some of you that know me might have heard before, but at one point Ron said there's that each of us live in a different time. Okay, that relativistically, that's clear relativistically. But here is the problem with this thinking. It is true mathematically that there are temporal effects and that locally time is unique for each observer, okay? No matter how close or far they are from one another. And there are local spatial effects as well. But what I am proposing as a solution to the issue of singularities, both at the level of black holes and singularities at the level of the Big Bang, which I think is far more logically to have been a big bounce, if one takes into account a theory of quantum gravity, which we do not have a definitive version of. So the fact is that this thinking that leads us to assume that we're all in a separate time. It is true perceptually, and it is measurable, and the mathematics of relativity are correct, but that is not what time is. Time is space moving in place within itself in a fourth dimension. It is not change. It is not movement. Those are local manifestations of time that play into perception of time and that are essential in our perception of time. So the issue is not that there's not simultaneity. The issue is that there's no perception of simultaneity that is possible given special relativity. But you've got this, what you end up with is if you follow the logic of relativity to its mathematical conclusion is it's mathematical mysticism. What you end up with is creation ex nihilo from a singularity, which virtually every physicist now denies the possibility of singularities. You can read numerous statements about that by the world's major physicists. So if there's no possibility for singularity, okay, either at the level of the black hole or at the level of the initiation of this phase of the observable universe, I'm not going to call it the universe, that likely, in my mind, logically would come from a big bounce, there can be no timeless, spaceless point. Let's apply it to the black hole. If there was a timeless, spaceless point in a black hole, there'd be no Higgs field. If there were no Higgs field, there'd be no fundamental mass, and the black hole would have no mass. Okay, if there was a timeless, spaceless point, a singularity at the center of the black hole, there'd be no quark degeneracy pressure. And what we know now is that without the strong force, the strong interaction, without quark degeneracy pressure, most of the baryonic mass in the cosmos vanishes. Most of the mass does not derive from the Higgs field. That's only the fundamental mass. Most of it derives from the protons and neutrons, from the strong interaction. That's been the thinking now for about 7 years or so in physics. Okay, so you cannot have singularities. And what this leads to is the impossibility that space is created and time is created with the Big Bang. This brings us back to the antinomies of Kant, which I mentioned, right? The second half of his antinomy on the infinity of space makes this seem to be a logical impossibility, which it is. It's a logical impossibility. So we end up with, if you look at the black hole, this notion that time is stilled in a black hole. Time is not stilled in any of the black holes in the cosmos. Every black hole is inactively feeding, not actively feeding in the sense of the accretion disk is coming into the center of the black hole, but that it's actively feeding on the microwave background radiation. That is 10 to the 30th power more plentiful as radiation than visible light. Every black hole is accreting, even if Hawking radiation exists. Every black hole is going through a net accretion, and therefore it's always changing. So if you bring up the issue of change and movement, it doesn't work for your black holes. Anyway, our conceptions of time and space based upon relativity are correct in the mathematics, but it ends up in a conception which is far more elegant than the one I'm describing, which is basically that there's absolute time and space, and within it, there are local effects in time, which are relativistic, and local effects in space, which are relativistic. Okay, we are completely wrong in our physics, which is why we're not finding solutions, which is why every aspect of cosmology is in question right now. Dark matter is in question, and dark energy is in question. Everything's in question because we've got the mathematics right and the conception wrong.
Thank you very much, Victor. Very interesting. Thank you. Josh.
Let me just finish up real quick there. Yeah, that was interesting, Victor, although I kind of preferred your comments on Flaubert a little bit. That was interesting too. Yeah, let me just wrap up what I was saying. So yeah, so there's a difference between the big paradox and trivial paradox. Trivial paradox, and we're already working within a intersubjectively agreed upon framework of understanding of an issue. Then paradoxes are resolvable, or and because we're working within. If we're working within an agreed upon understanding, that's when logic, propositional logic, and the mathematics makes sense to us. But the logic and the mathematics can't replace the qualitative notions that underlie them. When the qualitative notions, for example, paradigms, a shift, or in Wittgenstein's sense, the language games that we use to understand each other within a particular language game, we can have things that are false or true, paradoxical or contradictory in the trivial sense. But in a profound sense, when you shift from one language game, when you jump outside of a particular language game or a particular paradigm, the world becomes nonsensical. It becomes chaotic. It appears as incoherent, not impossible, not So but so I think that's the more fundamental grounding for as I think Olga was touching upon, a grounding, strangely enough, on all of our abilities to understand each other, because we understand each other founded upon the underlying paradoxical situation that we're on the fly contextually reshaping each other's understandings. And we abstract away from that to create objects like apples and oranges and then manipulate them and do the things that we do that allows us to kind of construct the world of the natural sciences in which we can conveniently apply mathematics. But those constructions really, when we from time to time find ourselves, nonplussed or surprised over a result, and we try and work it out within the context of the framework, within the particular logics that we use in that particular field of science are based, we're still operating within a framework, but then there's always this slow shifting of the frameworks themselves within this profound notion of paradox. Now, so let me just wrap it up real quick, but I don't think that puts us in a situation of nihilism to say that that's really the underlying fundamental condition or the nature of change or human relations, because I think that we find ways of being able to find new ways of understanding each other, to build things, to create, given that paradox, founded upon our paradoxical basis. It's the source of our creativity, not the mathematics and the logic, which often stifle it. All right, thanks.
Is it possible?
Thanks very much, Josh. Thank you.
Is it possible to follow up on what Josh was just saying, and also on what Olga said earlier?
Okay, 1 second. Can we get Terry first, please? I think he's before you. Is that all right?
Yes, yeah. Actually, it's drifted enough. I just thought I'd make the comment that I clearly, as someone from the science background, know so little about the dialectic that Al Vasquez cornered me beautifully on pointing out that my approach to science is actually dialectic. So I didn't know that because I do believe that objects are phenomena that are more relationships and processes. Actually, I'm very stresses that we didn't do that. When I say that space and time are relative, can people hear me okay? My internet connection says it's unstable.
We lost you for 2 seconds.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I'm. Is the voice quality okay?
We got you though. No, we got the gist. We got the whole thought.
All right. Then that was that. So I was just much amused by that. Most scientists are just completely unfamiliar with all of this terminology. They focus on the reproducibility aspect and leave it at that. And actually, I really am a good data point on that. I had no idea that the particular version of how I'm approaching physics would come under that category. So there's a whole body of thinking out there. And, we all sometimes reproduce ideas on our own without really being immersed in the literature. But that was a good one. Thank you, Al, for that. And I'm done.
Thank you very much, Terry. Thank you. Don. Hi.
Excuse me. Just clear my throat. I'm sorry. Just following up on Josh's point about major paradox and the connection with particularly with the late Wittgenstein, but also with Kuhn's notion of paradigm shift in science. I was very influenced by Kuhn when I was younger. I have a background that's primarily literary, but I also was pretty much involved in a lot of other disciplines, both in research and in teaching. And what Olga was saying about poetry, about metaphor, one of the problems with the discourses that tend to be focus primarily that focus on language, whether it's linguistic, from a linguistic perspective or from a propositional logic perspective, is that their main models still tend to be semantic representational models. And there isn't enough attention to questions of form at other levels of language. Somebody mentioned Lyotard earlier in our discussion. I also studied with Lyotard, and with Roland Barthes. I recently reread Kant's Third Critique. There's also been mentions of Kant primarily referring to the first two critiques. I recently reread Kant's Third Critique in Aesthetics, and I was struck by the fact that there was a more recent translation in English that I didn't know of. It's about 20 years old, where they changed the title of the Third Critique. All the earlier editions going back to about 1820, English translations of Kant, were titled The Critique of Judgment. This new translation in the early, I think it was about 2002, somewhere in there, added the word power, the critique of the power of judgment. And that's a major theme both in the the editor and translator, Paul Geyer's excellent introduction and footnotes to that edition. In my experience, going back to the 1950s, studying literature in America, there was the paradigm was first the new criticism. These tended to be centered at Yale, actually, and then later deconstruction at Yale. These were two kinds of formalism, two in some ways very different kinds, but it's not accidental that I think their lineage went through Yale. And in the first case with the new critics, there were brilliant formalists, and they were better formalists in most respects than a lot of the English critics, with the exception maybe of I.A. Richards and William Empson. But their interpretations of poetry and poetics, which would include fiction, prose fiction as well, relied primarily on Kant's, the first part of Kant's Third Critique, which is called The Analytic of the Beautiful. And they pretty much disregarded the second part, which is called The Analytic of the Sublime. I recently wrote about this, and I've got something that's going to be published soon. In the analytics of when you hear, if you were an undergraduate in an English class, you would have been told that if they talked about Kant at all, but they were usually talking about the new critics, the American new critics. The idea would be that the aesthetic is basically the kind of concrete universal. So it is an example, actually, of the notion of a something subjective that becomes objective through the poetic function. And you have titles like The Verbal Icon or The Well-Wrought Urn. These are very famous titles. The second one, Well-Wrought Urn, is a quote, is a reference to a John Donne poem. Now, the interesting thing about the well-wrought urn image is that it basically is an image of something that's past and dead. And that's to a great degree the way in which I was taught, you have to think about, so it's kind of, poetry becomes a kind of memorial to something dead. to some extent, Derrida, but also especially Lyotard, kind of shifted that in an important way. And it has to do with the power of resistance. And it has to do with the subject's recognition. And the sublime is basically, we usually think of the sublime as having to do something to do with, the enormous power in nature and our feeling about our own weakness in relation to that power. But actually, the way Kant writes about it in the second part of his treatise on aesthetics is the important aspect of the sublime is that we recognize in ourselves the power to resist what our sensory apparatus makes us fearful of. So resistance is a very important aspect, and active, not passive, not disinterested, which is another term that's associated with Kant's first part of his critique of judgment, and which is what the new critics emphasizes. Contemplation, disinterested contemplation, is the appropriate form of aesthetic appreciation. But the sublime in Kant's interpretation is actually something very different. And the last thing I'm going to say is the relationship between that second part of Kant's critique and the first part of Kant's critique already anticipates Hegel's dialectic logic. It's a dialectical logic. It is a logic, but it's a very different logic, and it's a logic of contradiction and paradox.
Thank you very much, Don. Very, very interesting. So that was very paradoxical generally, and I enjoyed all your contributions very, very much. And thank you for coming, and we'll see you next month. I'll send invitations out, etc. And good to see you all. I wish you all well, and we'll see each other soon. Bye, everybody.